All right, strap in, everybody. This is the big lecture on apartheid, trying to put everything together after you try to put it together yourself. We're going to go from the beginning to the end. It's a lot, but hopefully it places things in place along with your particular screencast that you did. Um, so when we look at this, let's first talk about discrimination. What that means is, look at this. You have discrimination. Discrimination in and of itself is not bad. Discrimination in and of itself is like you see differences. Okay, like going to the market, one fruit is rotten, one fruit's ripe. You choose the ripe ones. But discrimination is absolutely terrible if it turns into you are noticing the difference between things and it creates different treatment. Especially if that treatment is judged on race, age, or sex, and this happens a lot. Discrimination happens because of that, and it's really bad. We will get more into this, but I wanted to bring this up. There is two general types of segregation that are understood. When you segregate something, you are setting them apart, and that's not good. We will talk more about this, especially as we get into U.S. Um, civil rights movement. But understand this: there is two types of segregation: de jure segregation, and this is segregation that is by law, code, or legislation. Okay, South African apartheid is 99% de jure segregation. It is segregation by law. There's so many acts, there's so many things, there's just so much that South African whites do to create that thing called apartheid or separateness. Um, but remember, we're supposed to play this back and forth between South Africa and the United States. De jure segregation, you could talk the black codes of the South post Civil War. Plessy versus Ferguson created the separate but equal doctrine. Um, that was de jure. You end up with the Jim Crow era. There's many Jim Crow laws we'll talk about. World War II, you had Japanese internment, which was de jure segregation. So a lot of things there, but de jure segregation is by law. De facto segregation is a little harder to discern. The rote definition is that it happens by fact. Um, so if you see an example here is like today, you could have a school, like a school like STEM or a school like East or West. If it resides in a predominantly Asian, African American, Hispanic neighborhood, well, if that school becomes predominantly African American, Asian, whatever, it's by fact. You have segregated by fact of what's going on. See, here's the thing though, by fact and de facto segregation um, happened a lot in the United States. Um, there's this thing we're going to talk about called redlining, blockbusting. There was a lot of predatory lending, in other words, special types of lending for African Americans. Um, and this all creates problems because de facto segregation is extremely hard to stop. I have in quotations there, you can't stop racists from being racist. That de facto is almost more insidious than de jure. De jure you can fight, and that's what we're going to see in South African response to apartheid. That's what we're going to see in the United States civil rights movement. Is you can absolutely positively fight de jure segregation because it's laws. They're there. They're on the books. You can say this is what we are fighting. De facto segregation is extremely hard to get rid of because basically de facto when it's by fact, um, it's kind of really hard to stop a racist person from being a racist person and then have that racism come through in their dealings with other people and races and genders and things like that. We will definitely talk more about de facto as we get into African American civil rights movement in the United States because it's almost a little more insidious and it's not as in your face, which makes it harder to combat, which makes it very hard to let the north of the United States off the hook. I know we've heard a lot of how the South was um, very not good segregation wise in the early part of the 1900s. And well, we should say in most of history, but definitely during that civil rights movement. But the North really was too, and that's something we can't overlook. Um, so when we translate to South African apartheid, what you're really looking at is you want to make sure you understand the difference between petty apartheid and grand apartheid. And petty apartheid, and these kind of go together, guys. Petty apartheid and grand apartheid is like really they're almost one and the same, but kind of not. Um, So petty apartheid is you segregate in just about everything: bathrooms, train cars. You can't go to the same beaches, things like that. Um, and here's the thing: a lot of the petty apartheid things were practiced in the early years of colonial South Africa, just because it was how it was. The whites did their thing, the natives, the Bantu, did their thing, and as the colonialism grew, then there was a forced segregation, so it was de facto, but then it became de jure as all these laws get enacted to really lead into the grand apartheid of the 1950s and beyond, which was, remember, apartheid is extremely unique in history. It was what that definition says. It was pretty much any and all ways you could think of ripping the humanity and the civil and human rights away from a person. I mean, it is extremely unique in history in an amazingly awful way. I don't, if that comes through from the readings and it comes through from pictures and it doesn't come through necessarily from history either. Um, that's where sometimes watching some documentaries and stuff, it is a uniquely, amazingly awful thing. But so hopefully you can see that there is some differences between petty apartheid and grand apartheid, but grand apartheid takes that petty apartheid and makes it like 90 million times worse. Um, so, guys, again, I told you I'd start from the beginning, go all the way to the end to make sure you understand this. So, again, buckle in. My voice is going to be worn out and your ears are going to be worn out, but hopefully it helps. Um, so, what do we got historically speaking? Well, Africa was Africa. There was indigenous people there. They were mostly Bantu speaking. These are your blacks. These will be called your Africans or your Bantu. Hopefully, we have that because you guys were confused on this. What does happen? It's the era of exploration and colonization. Remember, the Dutch were big players early on in that, so they show up first. The Cape of South Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, becomes a relaxation port for the Dutch in their trading adventures, and eventually it becomes a major slave trading post. So here's the thing: the racial segregation and the racial inequities are already there to begin with. When you show up as a white dude and you start slave trading, that's not good. Um, the Dutch will establish this place called Robben Island. It's a trading place, but it also will become a giant jail. That's where Nelson Mandela is jailed. Um, so what you're seeing here is you will begin seeing a racial hierarchy in South Africa as early as the 1600s and 1700s. We talked about this before. I just want to make sure to repeat it and that you get it. And this is let's be honest. This is not unique. This happened pretty much all through the colonial era. Um, as I talked about, this happened in the Western Hemisphere. You had your criollos, you had your mulattoes, you had your peninsulares, you had a racial hierarchy in pretty much many of the places where there was different races. Um, you don't hear that in the United States because, well, the natives here were Native Americans, and as the whites move in, they took over. Disease kills off a lot of the Native Americans. The Native Americans get pushed farther and farther west. You don't necessarily need those racial classifications in the United States because they didn't really exist because of how the British colonies in North America show up. But pretty much everywhere else, they do show up. So let's not forget that. But it definitely, you are seeing this racial hierarchy being established even as early as the 16 and 1700s when the Dutch show up. Um, Also, remember, the Dutch want nothing to do with a colony in South Africa. But whoever's there hanging out, settling up this relaxation port, trading post, slave trading, they need to live. And it gets kind of hard. Well, guess what they start doing? They start farming. They start what's called animal husbandry, raising cows and stuff. So then they start settling, and a colony springs up regardless of whether they want it or not. Well, the British, of course, are going to show up because they try and want to command the sea, and the sun never sets on the British Empire. Um, they want to control the sea route around the Cape of Good Hope. Remember, that was kind of a big deal in trade routes. Um, they want to set up a fort there to kind of protect that, but then, of course, they get involved in the slave trade because it's extremely lucrative at the time. Again, there's your racial hierarchy emerging again. The British really don't want a colony there at all, but the settlers need to live just like the Dutch. They start farming, things start happening. Now you have a British influence there. Well, here's the thing about 1830. The British are going to realize slavery sucks. So they outlaw slavery in all of the Commonwealth and all of their colonies. Um, and if you notice a map there up at the top, that's going to be later on. But what we have is a bunch of people were getting confused. Well, now the people who were there from when the Dutch settled, they were farming, they were hanging out, they were creating a slightly different culture than the Dutch. They get nicknamed the Boers. The Boers is actually a Boer is a Dutch word for farmer. So the Boers will now be like the white Dutch descendants of the Dutch descendants. Um, but so now they're there. They embark on this thing called the Great Trek, which we'll get back to, because they're really upset with British decision making and how the British are trying to take over control there, like the British are known to do during their colonial period. Um, so they move inland and they set up a republic. Unfortunately, guess who they look to? They set up a republic kind of based on how the U.S. sets up their republic. They kind of look to that. Okay, great, wonderful. Um, but in setting up these areas inland, which you do see at the map in the upper right, these areas are set up with only white male voting, white male enfranchisement. Okay, the natives are not involved in any of this. As a matter of fact, usually the Boer have to fight a lot of the natives in those areas called the Zulu, create some bad blood. Um, in this time period, remember the British don't really care a whole lot what the Boers are doing as long as they're making their money. Remember, the whole reason the sun never sets on the British Empire is that thing called imperialism. You go to an area and you strip it of natural resources, send it back to your home colony. So as long as the money's flowing in, the British don't care what the Boers are doing. The British don't care what the natives are doing. Just make sure our money's still flowing in. Well, what is also happening at this time um, between the racial hierarchy things that are going on? Well, during this time, you are going to have the British expanding their influence, and you are going to have now the coloreds, which are the whites and the natives have maybe intermarried or something, and you have a mixed race. You're importing Indians and Asians to help do some of the work in the colony. So now it will already, again, you're talking 16, 17, 1800s. You are now starting to see the vestiges of what will become the apartheid and the grand apartheid. All right. These people, these Indians and Asians, are specifically imported for their labor. The coloreds are not seen as equal to whites, and obviously the natives or the Bantu, the blacks, are not seen as equals. So what you're going to see is you're going to see a lot of pass laws getting created. Natives, Indians, things of that nature can only go certain places at certain times. You're going to see the creation of ghettos in some of the major places throughout South Africa where, whites and non-whites are not allowed to live together, and the areas of non-whites are not as good as the whites. You're going to see a discrepancy of labor terms between white and non-whites. So a lot of the vestiges of apartheid are going to be created during these early, we're going to call them the 16, 17, 1800s. Well, South Africa is very rich in natural resources, and they discover two very important things: gold and diamonds during this time. And obviously, Britain is going to want them, and this is a big deal because it's going to create the mining industry, which your readings did a lot with, because the mining industry was a big deal. Um, well, when the Brits see an opportunity for more money, they go after it. You're going to have the South African War between the British and the Boer. The Boer will call it the Boer War. The Brits will call it the South African War. Regardless, there's a lot of loss of life. There's scorched earth. It's pretty freaking awful. But what happens is it is settled by this thing called the Treaty of Vereeniging, however you want to pronounce that. Um, well, the Boers get self-government, and the British were actually offering that for a while to those areas that were majoritively Boer that you saw in the map. But here's what the British didn't want to give them, because they were we wanted to disband slavery, yada, yada, yada. But they add something to the Treaty of Vereeniging that was different. They say the Boer, once they settle themselves down, will get to decide who gets to impose self-government, which means the Boer will get to say it's whites only, which was a big deal. So really the British could have said at this point, because they were winning the war, they could have said, listen, we're doing what's necessary here to get this colony going like we want to on a more equal basis. But they didn't care. They want their money. They want their diamonds. They want their gold. They want their farming. So as long as the Boers will settle down and the war can be over, whatever. And let's face it, you can get rid of slavery. That doesn't mean you get rid of racism. There was still a white man's burden, so to say. The Brits did believe they were also going around the world to civilize a lot of people. That's for another day and another time, though. So what's going to happen after the South African War? Well, there will be massive labor shortages because it's it's how it is. A war kind of gets rid of people, and there's increasing production that they want from the mines. So you're going to have to import more non-white workers into white mines and white farms to solve this labor shortage, which is going to equal a lot more integration between whites and blacks. And the whites, specifically the Boers and even the Brits to a point, are not going to dig that integration. So that is going to lead to some separation or segregation laws, as we will see. Also, a lot of the British policies were to denationalize the Boers. If you just fought this big old war that cost tons of money, well, we never wanted a colony, but hell, we got one now, so might as well make the best of it. So they want the Boers to settle down with this whole, hey, you used to be Dutch, now you're this Boer thing and whatever. We want you to be more like British subjects, so if we get rid of your ideas of the past, maybe you'll be more British, which means we can have more British move in, which just pisses off the Boer more. So remember, what's going to be here is now it's not just white versus not white. It's going to be Boer versus Brit, but they're both going to be against the non-whites. What ends up happening is the South African Native Affairs Commission gets enacted after the South African War, and they will have a bunch of discriminatory and segregationist policies that they say, here's how this needs to go to make the whole colony work. And what does come out of it that's big is that Africans, natives, non-whites will definitely, it's in the best interest of everybody for those people to stay separate and especially not enfranchised. They do not get any say in the government. If they get no say in the government, they get any say in how the country runs. But the problem becomes you're going to really make the people unhappy that you really need the labor from, because that's what, part of this is the hard labor. You want that hard labor to come in cheap. White laborers cost way more money. So we want cheap labor that's going to come from the native populations. So what you're going to see then, and guys, remember the whole IB thing we're studying for paper 1 is rights and protest. When people's rights are stripped of them, they tend to protest. It's a challenge response narrative, kind of, sort of. So when we go through this whole, like the rest of this presentation really becomes this. When a group is stripped of rights, they are going to protest. And then there's going to be more rights stripped, more than likely. And then there's going to be more protest, back and forth until something's done. Well, when all these things are happening and all these segregation laws are being put into place by the South African Commission, immediately you're going to have the natives and a lot of other non-whites starting to get together to protest these segregationist and unfair, unhuman rights, uncivil rights policies. And you can think of these groups are popping up in a very PEMS nature. When you think of the South African Native Congress, they are in the early years. Remember, this is right after the South African War in about 1905, 1910. They're going, well, this is a British colony now, right? Well, are we not British subjects? Are we not subject to the crown just like everybody else? So they will appeal to the British, royal mentality almost. You'll have the Native Vigilance Association, which really focuses on the education of non-whites and other non-white interests that they feel being stripped of them. So you got a political, you got a social, and then you got tons of other ones. All these I have listed here. Gandhi actually helped start one called the Native Indian Congress. There's tons and tons of them that are all focusing on these PEMS rights that are being stripped from the non-whites in South Africa. And this is already being noticed by people outside of South Africa. The oppressed people of South Africa are receiving attention as early as the early 1900s from people like that are in the African American rights movement. You already see that Gandhi is having South Africa receive attention. So as early as the early 1900s, even before the apartheid is implemented, you're going to have rights stripped, challenge to those rights because of protest, and then response from the government. So when we look at this, in 1906, there was a major protest called the Zulu War. As the Brits and the Boer are encroaching on Zulu land, the Zulu rebelled in a violent revolution called the Zulu War. Um, and it was a kind of a massacre. The Zulu warriors and the Zulu nation lost over 3 to 4,000. If I remember correctly, the white British lost like 26 people. It's one of the most lopsided victories ever. These are some things called Ezawanda and Rorke's Drift. Kind of they are immortalized in some movies. It's not good though, because really the Zulus were protesting their ability to have rights and their lands being encroached on. But if you were ever to find a movie about the Zulu War, it's definitely that, oh my God, the poor British are being surrounded, but look, they get to kill 3,000 of them. And guys, notice I put Nat Turner. If you know anything about the history of the United States, there was armed rebellion against slavery in Nat Turner's rebellion when people's rights are stripped and they have nothing else they feel like they can do. So again, while we are studying apartheid and civil rights, we do want to compare these things, and there are big old similarities and also differences, but there's big old similarities we will see. Um, so what do we got? We got the Boer again, so you're not confused, the descendants of the Dutch and the white. They don't dig the British, who hopefully you know are white. But remember, they're both white, so they're both against the non-whites. Um, but here's what begins happening. The Brits thought all this immigration was going to come to South Africa. It doesn't come to fruition. So what you begin to see is the Boer begin outnumbering the British people as a voting base. They absolutely get a little pissed at this whole denationalization thing, and that's where you get the rise of the Afrikaner Afrikaners. The Afrikaners, the Afrikaan language, that is white. The Afrikaners will be the descendants of the Boer, who are the descendants of the Dutch. Well, what are the Boer going to do in response? Kind of almost the challenge response narrative, I said. What are the Boer going to do? They're going to start creating their own culture that is separate from the Dutch and separate from everything. It will be them embracing their Boer heritage, or Boer, however you want to pronounce it. They'll have their own schools. They'll get their own language, the Afrikaan language. They will begin politically organizing between some so-called heroes of the South African War, Louis Botha and JBM Herzog. They will be dudes who will be around for a while up until the 50s. These guys will be founders of the National Party and a whole bunch of other stuff, but really just know the National Party. And then there will be a lot of economic issues surrounding work and pay that whites, Boers need to get treated as equal in, mines, and the British need to give them more rights than the blacks. And you don't need to know a ton about this because, as you see, this is like long history, but you need to know the history. Well, what ends up happening is, you remember the map on the other slide. You had kind of separate places of Boer and English. Well, you become the Union of South Africa. This is where you bring all of South Africa together under one political body, a parliamentary government. And they decide that all white males can participate in the government. Go figure. The first prime minister is going to be that hero of the South African War. By the way, supposedly he captured Winston Churchill at some point. Who cares? Louis Botha, he's a big old racist. He is definitely an Afrikaner, and he definitely is totally down with segregation. Guys, at this point, please remember, even today, South Africa is part of the British Commonwealth. We'll get more to that. So people are going, well, when are they independent in their own country? We'll get there. So what do we got? Well, if we start talking about that petty apartheid, you start seeing segregation policies get put into place, and will be growing into the separateness of petty apartheid. Following that Union of South Africa, yes, I did not see what I didn't do there. I put that there because I am not going to call it the USA. Okay. Following the Union of South Africa, tons of policies are going to be enacted by the Botha government that are going to completely protect white supremacy and completely stomp on the human and natural and political rights of non-whites. You get the Native Labor Registration Act. This is going to begin that pass law system, okay, where you got to carry a booklet that's a pass. It has your picture, your birth date, everything, your racial breakdown. And if a police officer stops it, you better be able to produce it, or you're going to either get thrown in jail or kicked out. Remember, past law is going to become a huge thing in the actual apartheid. It's starting here, and this is in the 10s and 20s and 30s. Okay, the Industrial Consolidation Act of 1924, guys. What you're going to see is this is basically no non-whites, natives, could own a business, nor could they have any skilled jobs, and even past bearing natives or non-whites can't negotiate, organize as a union. I'll pay you 10 cents an hour. That's what you're going to take. It's kind of completely takes away any bargaining rights or any job rights of non-whites. This is going to, in 1924, set those working conditions that non-whites are going to have to live under for till 1994, basically. And if you did the reading, even till today, because it hasn't fixed itself. But if you notice, both the Native Labor Registration Act and the Industrial Consolidation Act, they meet with protest. They meet with response. Because if you look, the Labor Registration Act meets with union organization. Well, we don't want the non-whites organizing, so that's when you get the Consolidation Act, that you can't have a union. Oh, by the way, you can't negotiate your trial, and you can't have no skilled jobs either. But that meets with challenge from the natives. They will economically mobilize, and black farmers actually get going pretty well. And black farmers will actually start equaling white production on farms, and that, again, challenge response. That freaks out the whites. So then they pass this thing called the Native Lands Act, and they take 93% of all land and put it in white hands. The non-whites, the natives, get 7%, and they get the crappiest land that you can't farm on. So every time there is a law, there's a response. So challenge response. Well, every time the challenge response gets met with further punitive action from this white supremacist. And the Native Land Act is basically then what you're talking about is it pretty much forces almost all natives, blacks, to work for whites, which becomes abject economic warfare as early as the 1910s, 1920s, even though you were even seeing it in the early 1800s. So petty apartheid keeps continuing. It's absolute segregation. The Urban Areas Act, the Native Act, if pass holding blacks remained in urban areas, they were going to have to go to a segregated area. They were going to have to rent from a white. They couldn't own land, and they could only do this if they had jobs, guys. So what are you doing? You're keeping the really good areas of the city for the white people, and you're taking a little tiny area, and you're making any non-whites live there, rent at exorbitant rates from whites, and they could only stay if they had a job. And remember, that job's going to be a crappy job, guys. See that? U.S. ghettos are kind of formed in a very similar manner post-Civil War after the Great Migration. So there are definite connections here we have to see. You're going to end up with a Department of Native Affairs in the white supremacist government. That basically what they say is we can control everything we want about non-whites, and a law about this stuff no longer has to go through the government, guys. Remember, legislation, even in parliaments, it's kind of like here. It has to be proposed. It has to get voted on in your legislative assembly. And then only then, after it goes through all these steps, can it actually become a law. Well, after some of these things and after some of these responses by the natives and by the non-whites, they just want more control. So the Department of Native Affairs can just decree anything. Oh, we don't like what you're doing. We're going to make a new law that says you can't do this. Well, are you going to get it passed through Parliament? Nah, it's just a law now, so shut up. And what all this is going to do, guys, is set the stage for the grand apartheid that is going to come in the 1950s. Because you see, even from the inception of this Dutch British colony, a systematically segregated place before the apartheid in this both the government, after the Brits kind of don't give as much of a crap as long as they're getting their money. You are systematically segregating in pretty much every way, politically, economically, and socially, whites from non-whites. And as you're doing this, remember, all the really amazing, awesome places of South Africa are being reserved for whites, and all the crappy land that can barely support survival are being reserved for the natives or the Bantu. So guys, again, The response is going to be protest, and it's in these early years that you're going to see the biggest organization that keeps coming up over and over and over again pop up in 1912 called the African National Congress. You must know the ANC. They were founded under a guy named John L. Dubé, um, and they were banned in 1960 because any group that the South African white supremacist government wanted to ban, they just go, "You're banned. People, governments, whatever. People, organizations, doesn't matter." But this ANC will be the longest surviving um, uh, protest organization, and it will be the organization that will help return South Africa to a moderate form of democracy with Mandela at its head in 1994. Um, it is definitely considered a moderate. It definitely wants their rights, but it is willing to include whites that will help them out. So they appeal to the British for rights and equality, again, maybe under that British citizenship thing. It organizes a lot of protests. There, most notably in your reading, there was a bunch of women that marched against pass law. There was a lot of labor strikes, again, especially mining strikes. Um, and they weren't necessarily successful because the government, white supremacist government, in true form, responds with a lot of brutal, deadly force. Um, and that's going to be kind of, again, we look at that challenge response. I keep saying that over and over again. If this white supremacist government is challenged, they respond, and usually they respond brutally. Um, and then it's going to lead to another challenge, which is going to lead to another brutal response. And kind of, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy that that's why this is going to fail. Well, first of all, it's completely immoral and awful, and secondly, because of that. But anyway, um, what are you going to see in response to all this government repression? The ANC is also going to have a lot of organizations by a bunch of different groups of Indians and a lot of other, a bunch of initials, so you don't need to know, like that ICU is the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union. You had the Mine Workers Union, all that stuff. They definitely expand resistance and strikes. Sometimes they're called stay homes, you just don't go to work. Um, and as the government gets more hostile, remember, this is all supposed to be modeled after that nonviolent protest, that civil disobedience model that you have hopefully heard so much that came from Gandhi. Um, but as the government gets ridiculously more hostile, and every single one of these civil disobedience, nonviolent movements gets met with beatings and shootings, um, you're going to see that elements of the ANC are going to move a little more radical as time goes on, especially as we get into the 1950s with that spear of the nation and everything, which we will get to. So you will start as early as 1912, even start seeing a divide of protest organizations. You will have conservative elements and conservative organizations. For instance, conservative elements of the ANC, they favor petitioning the government. They favor maybe a peaceful sitting protest. Um, but the more radical of the groups, the radical members of the ANC, favor mass action, maybe massive demonstration, maybe massive protests, maybe strikes, maybe sit-homes. Um, and they are actually, believe it or not, when you think about it, they are considered more militant and radical. That's kind of what won the day for U.S. civil rights for the most part. What we'll talk about winning the day is, but it was those kind of mass actions that helped win in U.S. civil rights. Well, all this is between the Afrikaners not digging what the British are trying to do to them, and feeling like that all these response organizations, such as the ANC, are going to strip away their God-given right for white supremacy. They start having a move to Afrikanerdom, and what that is just they want to make sure that South Africa becomes the nation of the Afrikaner. Um, JBM Herzog forms the National Party and is a party that will represent the interests of Afrikaners. They don't want to align to other parties. Some people consider them moderates, whatever, they're white supremacists. They definitely want to boot the British because the British just want their money, and they're only willing to go so far on the white supremacy scale. And the Afrikaners definitely want total and complete segregation, white supremacy, things of that nature. The move to Afrikadom creates many Afrikaner organizations. One of those is the Broederbond. It's kind of a secret society. It's not good. But guys, what are you saying here? Remember, this is going to be the time that you're going to see the move to fascism in Europe. Um, so they want to unify the Afrikaners through the Afrikaan language. So, oh my God, we have this Shreyer culture. Remember that thing called the Great Trek? Oh my God, it was amazing when the God-given whites went in and stomped on the Zulu. And wow, it was awesome. Hey, and you know what? When people don't think we're doing the right thing, what the Nazis have? That thing, don't they have those dudes called the brown shirts? Maybe we need to get guys like that to go around and stomp on anybody who doesn't think we're doing the right thing. And you know what? Maybe we need to burn a little bit of history that is not our history. So what I mean by that is they're going to take on a lot of Nazi eugenics, Nazi movements, things of that nature, and you'll see that more and more and more as the police state increases. Um, so you're going to see this rise of Afrikaner sentiment and a decline of British sentiment, which remember, for lack of a better term, the British are only there for the money. Are they cool with white supremacy? Sure, as long as it doesn't interrupt their money flow. And what's going to happen is it's going to interrupt the money flow. So what you really have is the Afrikaners want the money flow and the white supremacy, and that's going to be the thing that's happening. So what happens? I told you I'd come back to this. The South Africa is still part of the British Commonwealth, and the British Commonwealth is hard to understand, but understand this. Technically, they are under the rule of Queen Elizabeth right now. But really, it's just symbolic because they have their own parliament, their own government. They do whatever the heck they want. And then they just go, hey, yeah, rock out the Queen of England. So remember, they are technically part of the British Commonwealth. Sorry, we're going to fight through this. But once the Afrikaner influence keeps rising, it leads to the election of 1948, the South African elections of 1948. Afrikaner political parties, the National Party, United Party, and the Afrikaner Party, actually. The National Party takes the most seats, but overall they take 144 of the 153 seats in the South African Parliament. So they completely overtake the government. The National Party's D.F. Malan takes the Prime Minister. So what you get here is in 1948, you're getting a completely Afrikaner white supremacist government that believes total and complete utter control of racial separation and white supremacy is the best thing around. So if it wasn't bad enough leading up to this, of course it always gets worse. Again, your reader pointed out a lot of arguments for that. The Afrikaners clung to their white history of the founding of the nation, or they clung to the shared culture of the whites, or they simply said, hell, we'll make more money if we stomp on the non-whites. But overall, as we've hopefully learned over the past 2 years, this is probably a little combination of all the above that made it get worse because of the 48 election. Your reader does a good job explaining that maybe there is a giant effect by World War II here because, there was the Afrikaners who didn't want to get in the war at all, or they wanted to fight on the German Nazi side. The British obviously wanted to fight on the Allied side. So what's going to happen regardless? Wars make money. They're going to gear up. And remember, before World War II, they were mostly making their money off of farms and mining. They're going to gear into manufacturing and industrial production because World War II needs all that. Well, when all your whites go off to fight the war, you need people to fill the jobs. That's going to be your non-whites. It's going to cause massive urbanization. So what's going to happen is it's going to become a giant crush that all these segregation things you've put in place are going to kind of go by the wayside because so many non-whites are coming into the cities to get into this urban industrial thing going on. The Brits know they can't, during time of war, enforce any of these laws, so they actually relax them because who cares? Because we need to win the war and we need the supplies, but the Afrikaners are pissed because that was their thing. Remember, chicken or the egg? Were they white supremacists, or did they love money, or did they love money and white supremacists? Doesn't matter. They loved white supremacy. So when the Brits relax these things, it really pisses off the Afrikaners. And there's a giant job shift. Remember the Industrial Consolidation Act of 1924 that did not allow any non-white to take skilled jobs. Well, when you have 250,000 white males going off to fight in the war, you end up with those specialized industrial jobs having to be taken by Bantu or Africans. So now the Afrikaners are going to get completely pissed that now they're getting skilled jobs. You will create urban communities. Soweto is a great example of this. And it's going to invigorate the African National Congress, the ANC, because now, because the Brits need these supplies. You're going to allow trade unions to develop. You're going to have strikes. You're going to show that if you organize, that you maybe can get something done and get some of your rights back during World War II. It's going to completely piss off the Afrikaners, and the Afrikaner government is going to completely come back and try and crush these things with violent put downs by police. And it's going to create a lot of fear among the whites of, oh my God, what's happening to our wonderfully amazing, stupid white society and white supremacy. And what that's going to be, again, is challenge response. So post 48, with all those fears and stupidity in mind, they're going to make these vague ideas that they wanted called the separateness very concrete. And they act very quickly to quell those fears and those apprehensions of white supremacy with supernumerous acts to enact the separateness. You have the Population Registration Act. You have the abolition of passes and coordination of documents, which was stupid because it didn't abolish passes. It just completely controlled the movement of the natives and created concrete pass laws. It eliminated the old passes and made the new passes 10 times more white supremacist. The Group Areas Act, total control of the land of South Africa, and told people where they could live based on race. In other words, white people, you can live wherever you want. Black people, you can only live places we tell you, and these places we tell you will be tribal reserves in the Bantu Authorities Act. And by the way, the Bantu Authorities Act, if you are a Bantu or a native, you don't get any voting, so go away. And again, an especially crushing one was the Bantu Education Act. It made sure that an already separate, crappy, underfunded, and white-controlled system became even more crappy and separate and underfunded. Because remember, before the Bantu Education Act in the early 1910s, 20s, 30s, Bantu or Native education was already getting 16 times less funding than white education was in the country. And the Bantu Education Act lowered the non-white funding. And remember, now the education that everybody's going to get, including Bantu, is how amazingly awesome white people are and how crappy anybody non-white is. It's an attempt at brainwashing. And it's not going to go over well, thank God. So again, challenge response. So here you go. The whites were challenged. They responded with more crappy white supremacy legislation, which is going to lead in turn to a challenge of that legislation. Challenge response. Challenge response. Challenge response. Guys, what to remember is every response is just going to meet with more from the 1930s on. Every time there is any type of protest or response from the natives or from the non-whites to try and get some of their human or civil rights back, it is going to meet with brutal repression. So when we talk about this, you have the ANC. The ANC at this time is kind of like, hey, what's going on? We're kind of weak. We don't dig it. There's going to be a splinter group within. It's not different then, but it's a splinter group of the ANC called the Congress Youth League, the ANCYL, basically, the CYL. It's going to be led by guys. You have heard the names, hopefully, Oliver Tambo, but especially Nelson Mandela. They are going to advocate increased radical civil disobedience. And remember, at this time, strikes, boycotts, sit-homes, whatever you want to call them, is considered radical. They believe that the time for this passive resistance of petitioning the government is over. You will have the formation of the South African Communist Party. They are very similar to the Congress Youth League. They will call for greater direct action and direct civil disobedience. As a matter of fact, they stage a major strike on May Day of 1950, and the response from the government is brutal, and people die and are beaten to death. It's not good. In response to that, again, challenge response, the ANC, the CYL, and the South African Communist Party coordinate a national day of protest. Again, met with brutal repressions. So for every challenge, there's a response, and then for every response, there's a challenge. So when you see this pattern emerge, that it's what happens is people will protest the laws or the crappy situation already enacted. The government will respond by brutal repression and then even more repressive laws. A good example again. So you have, this is definitely, remember, United States. You can't separate history. This is during that Red Scare, pretty much all around the world, except in countries that were communist. Um, you have the national government, the white supremacist government, come out with it was the South African Communist Party. Well, everybody must be communist. Well, what they're raising fists. Fists must mean communism. Um, we're going to come up with the Suppression of Communism Act. And basically, guys, it's like McCarthyism that we learned about last year on steroids. If they deem you a communist, they deem you or your group a communist, they pretty much can do whatever they want. Throw you in jail, strip all your money, freeze all your assets, and without trial or without anything. We think you're a communist, you literally lose everything, including your freedom. So again, every challenge meets with a response. So when you look at this, this all leads to a big thing in 1952 called the Defiance Campaign. The ANC and the CYL coordinate with tons of other organizations to organize mass rallies against unjust segregation laws. It is the largest nonviolent campaign in South African history. It is supposed to be a day of pledge and prayer and of volunteerism. Mandela is a big leader in this. And in this, there is actually some whites and some coloreds that participate. And the whole thing doesn't sound that bad when you think of what this country experienced during the civil rights movement. It is a bunch of people singing songs with their fists in the air and thumbs up signs. Oh, that's terrible, right? Entering into signs and acts of defiance. And the big things they did, they walked into a whites only entrance to a subway. They stayed out past curfew and sang a song. They sat on a white only bench. They went to a white only beach and sang a song. They stood in front of a police station after hours and sang a song with their thumbs up. So this was the Defiance Campaign. And it was a large, when you think about it, for South Africa, it's considered extremely radical. If you think about this, it's pretty much what got the civil rights movement moving. Why is this significant? Well, because a lot of things happened from this Defiance Campaign. The white supremacist government arrests almost 9,000 people, but the membership in the ANC jumps to over 100,000. There should be another zero there. Sorry, guys. Albert Luthuli becomes the leader of the ANC. He's a big deal. He will not advocate any acts of violence. He believes the path will be civil disobedience and peace. He's separate from Mandela. Remember, Mandela becomes kind of sort of freedom fighter, terrorist, whatever side of this you're on. He does win the Nobel Prize in 1960 because of his attempts at passive resistance. Because of this because it spreads all over the country, the United Nations recognizes the human rights violations of the South African government. And what it really shows the whites is that if you have solid leadership of non-whites and that solid leadership coordinates between all these different organizations, they can get some stuff done. And it really scares the crap out of the white supremacists. And again, that challenge and response thing, bunch of acts, Public Safety Act, Criminal Law Act, basically the government can say, oh man, there's another protest. It's a state of emergency. And literally, if they declare a state of emergency, they can do whatever the hell they want. They suspend all laws, they suspend all procedures, and if they think for any reason that you are someone they don't like that's a non-white, they can literally just throw you in jail for however long they want without trial. So again, they up the ante. This is really, after the Defiance Campaign, this is what really turns Nelson Mandela to believe that violence is really the only answer. And when Mandela starts saying, I think this passive stuff isn't working, remember, the government can do whatever they want. They ban whoever they want. You're banned. You got to stay in your house. You're banned. You're going to be in a trial. You're banned. You're banned. You're banned. But the ANC and Albert Luthuli, the bunch of these guys come out with this thing called the Freedom Charter, which is a big deal. It was a Declaration of Rights that was published not only in South Africa but across the world. So what's the response from the white supremacist government? They censor whatever the hell they want. Nothing's allowed to be published without their okay. So again, challenge response. So, what is some major fallouts? There's a lot of fallouts, but what are those major fallouts from the Defiance campaign? Well, there was this thing you read about called the treason trial. It's where 156 activists were jailed, and they went on trial, but it took 4 years. And it's not, again, guys, it's not like this country. There's this thing called habeas corpus, means present the body. It's a rough translation. In other words, a lawyer can say, where is this dude? He needs to come, and that's not the case in South Africa. You're jailed. Well, when are we getting tried? Whenever the hell we feel like it. But in the treason trial, everybody is found not guilty. The Defiance campaign does cause an ideological splinter in the ANC. Um, it's a splinter group called the Pan African Congress, um, and they are again a splinter group of the ANC. They they say that there should be tons of protests against past law, and challenge any arrests that are arrests that violate laws that are unjust, basically. That does lead to what's called the Sharpeville Massacre, guys. That is a big deal. Um, there was a protest in front of a police station, a massive protest, and the police simply opened fire. They don't care. It leads to 69 dead and 186 wounded. And after the whole thing is over and some of the details leak out, much after apartheid has crumbled in 94, most of the wounds were suffered in the back, which means most of the people were running away, and the police just opened fire. Again, that challenge response, 30,000 march on the government building. Again, government can do whatever the hell they want. They declare a state of emergency, and they throw 18,000 in jail, and all those are considered outlaws, and they're outlawed from any type of protest or anything. That leads to the Spear of Venetium, Umkhonto we Sizwe. It's the militant wing of the ANC, so it's technically part of the ANC, but Mandela is a leader in it, and we don't think this passive stuff is getting anything done. They will commit acts of terror and violence. They will bomb police stations, they will bomb power plants, they will bomb places. Supposedly, and I'm not getting into the right or wrong of this because as we see, it's pretty wrong what the government is doing, but I'm not going to get into the right and wrongs of violence. Supposedly, the Spear of the Nation is targeting explosions on very least populated places. I'll leave that up to you to decide. They also do, remember, there are going to be collaborators. Sometimes if a black or non-white would cooperate with this white supremacist government, they get some favors, some benefits, and we'll see that more as you get into, the creation of the independent, supposedly independent states for the coloreds and for the natives. But they're also going to find collaborators and execute them very publicly and very violently. So again, the terrorist versus freedom fighter analogy, especially for Mandela, who becomes the prime minister. This does lead to the big thing called the Rivonia trial. The Rivonia trial is where 17 MK, remember MK is short for Umkhonto we Sizwe, 17 MK leaders are captured. 8 are sentenced to life in prison, including Nelson Mandela. Remember, guys, this trial was 63, 64. Mandela's in jail until the 90s. So that's kind of a long time. Luthuli, who is the leader of the ANC and won the Nobel Prize in 1960 and always advocated civil disobedience and nonviolence, is banned to a tribal reserve, and that's where he dies. He does right there. He does help some of the protests and campaigns, but he's never allowed back in supposedly what's known as South Africa proper. And the government, again, with a challenge response narrative, when all this stuff happened and Sharpeville and the Defiance campaign, they're freaking out. They create BOSS, the Bureau of State Security, and it's legitimately like the Gestapo in Nazi Germany, and worse, I don't know, but they find you. If they don't like you, you're thrown in jail, or you're beaten and thrown in jail, or you just disappear. And it's totally legal because the white supremacists are making the laws. So throughout the 50s into the 60s, what you have is, oh my God, all these things and all these protests and all this challenge response. So the government, the white supremacist government, says we need something even better, and better being for them, called the Grand Apartheid. It is the complete removal of Africans from white areas. And it's going to be moved to these tribal lands, or whatever they want to call them, the tribal reserves. They want the Grand Apartheid to be the complete and utter separation and removal of Africans. It's a massive social engineering project for the next 30 years where they want non whites and blacks out of white areas, strip them of any type of way of protesting the government, voting, and basically you're making them complete non-citizens in South Africa. Because what the idea is these crappy tribal lands, they'll turn them into independent states. So we don't have any control over them. So hey, you can be a citizen of whatever that crappy tribal land is. Oh, that's right. That tribal land can only really hold 100,000, but it has 1 million on it. Well, I don't know what to do. Deal with it. But then the major problem becomes that the economy of South Africa is built on the backs of the non-whites. Should I said there? You kind of should, economy on their backs, crappiest lands, not citizens. Should kind of ring a bell here, maybe pre-1865 United States. Just kind of saying. Guys, and here's where I would be remiss if I tell you some of this stuff. Remember, apartheid is supposedly IB land is 1948 to 1964, and it's supposed to, you're supposed to be seeing into the apartheid, and then you're supposed to kind of ending in IB land at the Rivonia trial and the jailing of Mandela and some of his compatriots. But the IB has a way of asking you questions that are causes of the rise of the 48 apartheid government, and then the IB has a way of asking you some fallout of the Rivonia trial. So that's why we're going into this. That would become the grand apartheid. And basically, guys, what you have to understand, we're not going to get a whole lot into this because I don't want to go totally forward here. But when you get into the grand apartheid, you're literally stripping someone of everything, of all human dignity and all human rights. And at the end of the day, that was that chapter you were supposed to read on grand contradictions, is when you try and have total control and when you degrade someone so much to the person of not even so much to the degree of not even treating them human, then it kind of leaves nothing. I got nothing to lose. Why not become way more radical? So what does happen in the grand apartheid? Those tribal lands are supposed to be homelands. They're going to become independent for blacks and non-whites. They were just total disasters. You had strong men rise up. You have famine. You have political turmoil. You have economic instability. You have social disaster in education. And it's not working. And it's going to lead to massive strikes, massive disasters, basically, guys. And what's going to happen is you are going to see a drop in economic output. Kind of like now we harken back where we look at things, slavery. Well, that's why there was ways of fighting slavery before 1865 that didn't involve revolt. I just work really slow. I look like I'm working really well, but I work really amazingly slow. So what you're going to be seeing is now you're going to see some drops in labor quality and drops in labor output, which is going to start in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, start alerting investors outside of South Africa that were investing in the country. What the hell's going on? After the Rivonia trial, you are going to lead to the Black Consciousness movement. The Black Consciousness movement is going to have a lot of influence from the Malcolm X, kind of the Black Power movement in the United States. It's going to be led by a guy named Stephen Biko. And really, it's non-whites have to work together because they can't depend on whites in any way. And you have to have this black concerted consciousness together. And what's going to happen is it's going to lead to the submit or rebel mentality that blacks must, Bantu must depend on themselves. And nobody really wants to submit. You're going to see the Soweto uprising in response to the challenge response narrative of the government going, well, we have to give them even worse education. We're going to teach them in Afrikaans, which none of them understand anyway. Soweto uprising is response to that. Again, a brutal response there. People beaten to death, shot to death. And what's all this going to lead to is it's going to lead to more and more brutal repression. As a matter of fact, Stephen Biko is beaten to death in jail, as many people are. I think the number of people beaten to death in prison rises like 400% or something. Like 67 people are beaten to death in like 1 year in jail. And add to all this that surrounding them, Mozambique and a lot of other African nations that used to be under the yoke of colonialism are falling to independence, and having black governments rise up there. So all this is not looking real good for the white supremacist grand apartheid contributors. Um, so what's going to happen late in the 70s? You're going to have the government say we need a total strategy against this because we're having a total onslaught by the non-whites. Um, and it's just going to be, why I'm not going into this a lot, guys, is because it's technically outside of what you really need. You really need that early stuff. Um, but what's going to happen, and most people would agree with this, is if left alone, the South African government would have continued to be racist, white supremacist, awful people. Um, but what happens in the late 70s, early 80s? Things, you got TV, you got mass communication, and you begin to see that what's going on in South Africa ain't exactly cool. And a lot of places around the world, you can't defend doing business with something that's so awful, guys. Again, this system of apartheid was kind of unheard of in human history. Um, so foreign companies, especially a lot of United States investment companies, start pulling out. That's called divestment. They begin extracting their money and their resources from South Africa. Um, the UN starts embargoes because of human rights violations. So what you're going to see is a massive, massive collapse of the South African economy because of this divestment. And you're going to see that the racist white supremacist government is going to have to start making some consolations. They try a thing called the 1983 Constitution. Um, and it's just a veiled attempt at reform. It's kind of a crappy thing. But what does happen is during the 1983 Constitution, they say, hey, Mandela, we'll release you from jail if you help us out. And he says, nope, thanks, I'd stay in jail. Then Mandela is eventually released in the early 1990s. And he's elected prime minister in 1994. So what you do have is, and it's not a riotous thing, it's a peaceful transition from a white supremacist government to a non-white prime minister. And while that sounds all great and good, and the apartheid was dismantled, kind of, sort of, the big takeaway here, as far as getting way outside of what you really need to know for IB Land and Paper One, is that if you did the reading for the last reading, is that you can shroud this as much as you want, but when you have over 300 years of radical white supremacy and radical race policies that are interpreted, especially during the apartheid and the grand apartheid, you don't dismantle that in 20, 30 years. You kind of can put some band-aids on it, but whites still make way more than blacks in the country, even though, again, remember, during this entire time, we haven't really brought up the statistics. Remember, all throughout the period of apartheid and even into the early 1900s, late 1800s, the white population is only about 20% of the country. The non-white Bantu population is over 80% of the country. It talked in the reading about, how they're trying to make it a travel destination and all beautiful golf courses. But really, if you travel outside those tourist areas, it's really, really awful. So, the takeaway here from outside of way Paper One and why we went all the way to the end is you can try and say you get rid of something, but when you have it in place for so many years, it's really hard to get rid of in a couple years. And when we look at, when we come to look at U.S. civil rights, slavery was around in this country from the 1700s to 1865. And then you had the really awful period of Jim Crow, Reconstruction, Black Codes, Plessy versus Ferguson, which was a segregation along the lines of apartheid, just not as bad in the American South. You had de facto racism and de facto discrimination and de facto segregation in the northern cities. So when you go all the way to the return to democracy in South Africa, and when you go all the way to the current day in South Africa, you don't get rid of these things overnight. And you can still see that in South Africa today, and you can still see that today in the United States also, if we're looking at the compare and contrast between apartheid and U.S. civil rights movement. Hopefully this helped. I know it was long. My mouth hurts. Your ears are bleeding. But I'm hoping it put things together for you in a concise format, along with your screencasts and presentations that will help you have the facts and knowledge to be successful. When we look at things, guys, remember this slide. These are the things that the IB wants you to know. And again, when Paper One pops up, it's a very good thing. Like there are some challenges that the IB brought to the table for your testing period, but one of the good things for paper one is it will say something like, this paper one will focus on petty apartheid and grand apartheid, or this will focus on the key groups of the, it will highlight one of these things, and that means you can really focus in on that. So when it comes to your paper one on Friday, make sure you look for that. You look for that, and you really focus on that knowledge and that content knowledge and that information. And then you get into the skills of a paper one again. Remember, you are going to get, now it's very definitive, hopefully. Sometimes the IB is a little squirrely about this. You will get 4 sources. 3 of those will be written sources. One of those will be a visual source. That visual source can be a picture, a political cartoon, a graph, anything visual. So remember, our question 1A and B are source evaluations. 1 written for 3 marks. That means give 4 things. 1 visual, that means 2 marks, give 3 things. That way, if you get 1 wrong, hopefully you're getting some points. Really evaluate those guys. Remember, you get 5 minutes to just read, but you turn to the questions first. So you read the question, you go to the source. You're looking for what the question is asking you. After they say begin writing, you should spend about 10 minutes on the source evaluation, question 1A, 1B. Direct yourself right to question 2 then. And again, in those 5 minutes, go through all these questions really fast as you read the documents. Don't just read the documents. Question 2 is you'll do 1. I repeat, 1 OPVL. Now, guys, it is at this point kind of called an OP little tiny c VL, based on the origin and purpose and content. What are the value and limitations, guys? I didn't want to tell you that. We'll talk more about that as we get into civil rights, but I think the content portion can be confusing. So just go with what we said, which is the state the origin, state the purpose, value on origin, value on purpose, value on limitation on origin, limitation on purpose. Remember, don't say it that way. One value is, another value is. Question 3 will be your compare and contrast, guys. If you look, question 2, 7 to 8 minutes on OPVL, 17 to 18 minutes on compare and contrast, guys. Remember, that is a running compare and contrast. Whenever you specifically state a source, you must specifically state the other one. They both do this. For instance, where source A says blah, source B says blah. Specifically bring them together. They differ in this, where source A says this, source C says that, or whatever. And then remember, question 4 is your supposed constructive response based on the sources and your own knowledge. Guys, remember the rubric we talked about. If you don't include outside knowledge, you're looking at a 1 to 3 out of 9. No bueno. Let's make sure after you do your presentations, after you're doing this PowerPoint and you're writing down some notes, guys, make sure you're studying your content. And then remember, question 4 is just a timed writing. Thesis, put your sources into, I think these are telling me this is telling me this, perspective-wise. Come up with some topic sentences. The sources simply become your knowledge. You must not go ABC. Remember that. You have 24 to 26 minutes for that, based on your other things. Guys, watch your time. Watch your time. Watch your time. Watch your time. Hopefully this all helped. Have a great break. Have a great week. And I will see you upon my return.